129. This is a significant line. You're not a young man any longer. Let's write that line down and think about the significance of that. He then, we are told, we're told that he drives around aimlessly for a time on page 129, last lines, and then drives past the hospital, and that will lead then to the second secret life. In the hospital, in the operating room, he fixes the machine with a fountain pen, and he's able to take over, right? In other words, Mitty, in his secret life, has the ability to be assertive, to be strong, to be confident. People rely on him. We need your help, sir. No worries, I'm there. I'm taking care of the business. But then all of a sudden we're back to it again in the real world on page 130, and he's very inept. Can't even back up a vehicle well, right? He makes the observation on 131, people are so cocky. They think they know everything. Then, of course, he has to get his overshoes. He's walking in the snow. He's got to put these rubber shoes on. Jot down at 2b, how do oversoles become a symbol in the story of something, right? That symbol of, what are overshoes for? Well, what do you do when you put on galoshes, right? You put on another shoe on top of the other one. In other words, you're trying to cover up in some way. We're back to that word secret again in the title, aren't we, right? He's always getting things wrong. He never can remember. Note the irony. He can't remember what it is his wife's told him, something about getting stupid biscuits for his puppy, but he can remember in detail these extremely romanticized and exciting stories. His next one happens on page 131, number 3. He's in a courtroom, he's a crack shot with a pistol, and he's even got a girl who falls into his lap. In other words, he is the guy everyone envies. He's the guy everyone wants to be like. And then, snapped back again onto the sidewalk, and he says it out loud, puppy biscuits. So we're moving right back and forth between two different worlds. A real world, which is painfully humdrum and boring, and then this other world that he lives in. Of course, we're in the fourth one. He's the war pilot, right? And no one can help save except for Walter Mitty. He's the guy who has to help save all of the world with his ability as war pilot. Notice he's kind of careless and carefree. And then he gives that line again, we only live once, Sergeant. I think this is the key line of the story, and we'll have to come back to ask maybe what it means here in a little bit. By the way, did you just notice the repetitions for Thurber of that sound? Every time he's in something, every time he's in a situation, right? That pocket, that kind of thing, right? It kind of brings us back into his secret life. He says it, right, with his, on page 133, he says it, things close in, right? What said Mrs. Mitty? Did you get the what's its name? You know, she snaps him back. Come on, I need you. Enough with the daydreaming. He says it at the top of page 134. I was thinking. Does it ever occur to you that I'm sometimes thinking? By the way, this exchange at 3a can remind us of that exchange in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, where in fact she will say to him, what are you thinking? Why are you never... And he'll say it, I think we are in Rat Sally, where the dead men lost their bones and all of that, right? That exchange back and forth, she of course making him feel like an idiot, and he's saying, leave me alone, I was thinking. Of course, technically, was he thinking or was he daydreaming? And what is daydreaming? We're going to write that one down at 3b and ask about it here in a little bit. Some of the greatest genius that have ever lived, Einstein comes to mind. He said imagination is more important than knowledge. And Einstein was classic as a student. Remember, this is a fascinating story about him. He would sit in school and he would daydream, look out a window. He could never seem to focus on the silly stuff that was going on in the classroom. He had these amazing imaginations, and here we have them. Of course, we're going to finish with our fifth one at the very end. It is significant that it's a firing squad. Jot down what you think is significant about the way our story ends with a firing squad, and he is ready to take it. He says, in fact, to hell with the handkerchief. He took one last drag on his cigarette. Before it's, of course, a little bit of brandy. In other words, he is kind of that representative movie hero who has no fear to die. He's ready to die. I've lived a great life. I'm ready to die. Well, let's now study this text at 2a. What is this text really about? Thurber, of course, is making the observation that T.S. Eliot will make. You'll study this poem in your junior year called The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Whereas people get older, they kind of realize that they've become less and less necessary, less and less useful. And now as an old man, he is sitting there realizing that his life has been lived in the most boring of ways in the real world, but of course, in his fantasy world, in his mental world, he lives this life of a hero. Let's say it this way at 2a. We often wish that we can live a different life than the one that we live. We often long to live a more exciting life, a more romantic life. And I'm using that term romantic not as it relates necessarily to love, but more about exciting, right? Having something of value. Number 2, possible message. Mitty is stuck in a world that we would call modernity, right? He lives in this world where everything is done for him. You go and you buy biscuits for your puppy. You've got these these shoes that go on to your other shoes. Everything's provided for him. In a world where everything is provided, he has nothing to do other than to drive his wife into the city and to try and make sure that he does the things that she's wanting him to do. He has no life of his own. And because he has no life of his own physically, he constructs that life in his imagination. Let's finish with a third possible message. Imagination is very powerful. Notice it's tied to the stuff that's happening, and then all of a sudden there he is, off living in his own world, in his own mind. Well, at 2b, the obvious question now is, do we see Walter Mitty as a round character or as a flat character? Now, scholars have debated this one. We normally are going to see, however, Walter Mitty as at least a character who does not really evolve. He doesn't really develop. So it's difficult for us to think of him as a round character. As you go back, for example, and look on page 125, we ask about him, is he a round character or a flat character? There's several possible answers to this that you might give. Well, if you're thinking about a round character as a character who's complex, showing many different qualities, the only way we can argue that about Walter Mitty is when we're talking about him in his fantasy world. Of course, what's wrong with that? That's not really Walter Mitty, is it? Those are only his imaginations, right? Is he in fact a dynamic character? Does he develop? Does he change? Does he evolve? Does he learn something? It's hard to argue that the real Walter Mitty does. It's easy to argue that the Walter Mitty of the secret lives, of course, is all of those things. To that degree, we often will see him as actually a static character. He doesn't actually evolve very much. Of course, we do have an interesting observation at the very end when he says, things close in. And then he says to his wife, I was thinking. It's almost like he comes to some insight, some perspicacity, but yet at the end of the story, it's in another world where we finish, and poor Walter Mitty is ready to go ahead and say, I'll let them shoot me without the handkerchief. At 3a, of course, we can think about a number of texts where we have all kinds of musings. I want to give you one that you're going to come to later in your high school career. Write this one down. The great writer Cervantes had the classic text Don Quixote, a story about a man who reads books and then decides he wants to be a famous knight. So he goes off with Pancho Sancho and he does these amazing kinds of adventures. The only problem is none of these adventures actually happen. The classic example is he looks up and he sees windmills, we know them as windmills, and he says, there's great monsters for me to fight. And he rides his broken down old pony, nag, that he thinks is a great horse, and he fights against these windmills and he gets jacked for it, okay? And in the end, the whole story of Don Quixote is a story about a guy who goes through all these terrible things in real life, but in his mind, he's this amazing, amazing fighter, warrior, knight. Okay? Well, obviously, Thurber is playing with the conventions of Don Quixote. Cervantes is Don Quixote. I'll ask you this. What's your favorite text about living in two worlds? Okay, there even have been movies, have there not, where you're hooked up to a machine. I'm thinking, of course, of something like Matrix or whatever, where in the other world, the world outside or inside in the mind, it's an exciting world. Let's jump to 3B. Now, I don't mean to insult when I ask this question, but to what degree is gaming playing in a secret life, in another life? And to what degree then is playing games healthy or not healthy? In other words, say it this way for yourself. In the same way that Walter Mitty uses his secret lives to escape his boring life, is that what gamers do? Do gamers escape their boring life, their not so exciting life, for a secret life, an exciting life, where when they're gaming, they can kind of almost like become part of the game, and then for them, they can escape? Is that a good thing, or is that a bad thing? In other words, the question is it healthy for Walter Mitty to be sitting in a hotel lobby and to not be sitting in a hotel lobby, but he's sitting in the cockpit of an airplane flying over some occupied territory? Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? And what about daydreaming? Where do you come down on this one? Is that a good thing or a bad thing to always be daydreaming, to always be thinking about where else you could be? I used to do this on the first day of school, a project with my seniors where I would say, I want you to write me something, and they would of course groan, and I'd say, no, here's my topic. My topic is simply this: where would you rather be than right here, right now, and who would you rather be with? And this is total fantasy. Where would you rather be? If you could be one other place than this place right now, describe it. And who would you be with if you could be with one other person and describe that? I got some very interesting essays that came out of that, and it often reminds me of the life, the secret life of Walter Mitty. Final question for you at 3B. It's really a 3A question as well, but it's an opinion question. Why do you think Thurber, the writer of this story, did not want this text to be made into a movie? Why? Like, couldn't this text be easily made into a movie? You got a guy sitting there at the stoplight, then all of a sudden he's in this fantasy world. Some readers of this text have said, Thurber understood this is a text which transcends film. It can't really be made into a movie because you've got that movement back and forth, and it's all kind of psychological. In other words, the beauty of this text is you can see him standing there at the firing squad at the end of the story, even though, of course, he really isn't at the firing squad at all. There's something lost maybe in the translation of the film. I challenge you to watch the film and see what you think about the two films that have been made, one of the two films that have been made. Well, there you go, an introduction to the secret life of Walter Mitty. Thank you.